God spoke to us in real space-time history, and it can be demonstrated. Because that concept is so powerful, people attack it. Oh, it's been so long ago, you can't prove Jesus was really here. Right? It's like April 23rd, 2025. Well, yeah, you can. And if you make us do it, we can show it, and that's sort of what we're doing today. There's evidence, like I was talking to John about this earlier, and I'll get to him in a second, but like Julius Caesar, we know about Julius Caesar, right? But if we were to throw away the 27 clearest references, their books to Julius Caesar, we might not know anything about it. That's what a lot of people do with Jesus. Well, you got to discount all the New Testament. Well, that's not fair. Just throw away the New Testament references to him. But even if you do that, which is what we're going to do tonight, is you can still prove Jesus was there. And even people who aren't Christians say, yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, he was there. So anyway, we're going to talk about the extra biblical evidence to the historicity of Jesus. And John's going to come up and take it for us. He does a really good job. All right, I built you up there.
Okay, so the question was, is there proof for outside of the Bible that Jesus existed? So, believe it or not, I know in this room it's not true. Should they ask in the UK, and 40% of the UK believes that Jesus is a myth.
John.
Yes.
Your mic's not on, or it's not turned up.
We need to turn.
Yeah, we don't.
You just
Talk louder. That's all you need to do.
Okay. I'll pretend, I am going to pretend that I am talking to Phil.
You got it. You got it.
Okay. All right, so 40% of the UK believes that Jesus is a myth, that he never existed. And, you know, I had a friend that I grew up with, and we would go play golf, and he passed away last year, but he would ask me all these questions. He would ask me all these questions about Islam, and what did I have to say to that. I spent the time, basically every time we go play golf, defending what I believed, and finally I'd had enough of it, and I said, Jeff, why don't you tell me what you believe? And he didn't believe anything. I don't really know what I think about that, you know? It's like, so as I started to look at this, I thought, what about the people who believe there's a mythology? How much fact, what do they hang their hat on, okay? And so looking into that, they basically believe that Peter had, and I had to listen to all this, so y'all are surely going to hear it from me, okay? And I can tell you that this is going to sound as stupid as it comes, and it is, okay? But they believe that Peter started hearing voices. And that voice was Jesus talking to him. And that some of his friends who were considered disciples, and they started hearing voices too. And we know that Paul got knocked down, got blinded on the road to Damascus, and that was basically him hearing the voice too, but it's all mass hysteria, and it never really happened, and they think that Jesus never really existed, and he was a made-up person that somehow swept through the Roman Empire without a battle, without anything, and basically won it, 300 or so years after his death, okay? So, and to do this, they take, they look at the book of Paul and they say he never tells any stories about Jesus, okay? And I'm thinking, are you reading the same Paul that I am reading? I mean, Paul says that Jesus isn't risen, then we're the most to be, greatest to be pitied for that, you know, that how important that is. Jesus, he's all the time talking about the life of Jesus, but they don't believe the synoptic gospels because they're too identical, and yet they're not identical. If they were, they should be telling the exact same story. There's a little bit difference between them. Viewpoint, you know, it's like eyewitness viewpoints are always a little bit different so they discount the Gospels. They think the Gospels were written, and this is what German scholarship gave us in the, you know, what the great theologians gave us in the 19th century is that the book of Mark was probably the first one written, and it was written probably around 70 AD and outside the land, and the other Gospels were written probably by late 1st century or early 2nd century, and that, so they're all made up, and that's how, what goes, you know, that's how they basically believe that these letters never took place. Luke was written in 90 AD, and Acts was written after that. That's what they believe. So when was the book of Acts, when does the story of the book of Acts finish? Do you know what year it actually finishes, the story? Finishes around 62 or 63. I don't know if you remember, Paul is still in prison, okay? In his first prison. He's released from that, we know, but not because the book of Acts tells us. We know that he's later arrested again and he ends up being beheaded. But that's done by 66 or 67, and that's not in the book of Acts. But supposedly in 90, when they wrote the book of Acts, they didn't mention any of that stuff, okay? And it's like, and the book of Luke was written before that, okay? And, you know, I spoke a month ago on the book of Luke, and I really think that the book of Luke was written to Theophilus, the high priest, and he was the high priest between 37 and 41. So all the history points to, and that's not somebody going, oh, that's just what I think, you know, I'm taking that by faith or whatever. That's what the evidence points to, or good scholarship points to. But the scholars that don't believe, and I realize it's a minority, a very small minority that believe that Jesus was a myth, I don't know. I guess they just never read the books, okay? Because what they do to pass as scholarship is just not very scholarly, in my opinion. Do you remember was anybody familiar with the Jesus Seminar? Okay, so the Jesus Seminar got together with the Gospel, and they included the book of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, and they decided, they got together to figure out what of the books Jesus actually, what's in the Gospels of things that Jesus actually said. You know, the red letter text. What did Jesus say? Do you know how they decided what Jesus actually said? They voted. They had color codes, and I guess black said you had a ball of marble and you could put it in there. If he said this sentence or not, and they would, black mean he's never said it. Gold meant he definitely said it. Pink meant I'm not sure. And that's how they just basically went through and rewrote the Gospels from it. Does that sound by what they thought? Not by what evidence shows or anything like that. So this is the type of scholarship that's done, okay? So it doesn't, so when somebody tells you that Jesus is a mythological or legendary creature, we actually have those. We have people like Hercules. Hercules was mythological, but he was also a man. And his father was a god. And he did great things. He did a lot, but how do I say this? It's when you read it, you know it's a myth, and you know it's not true. You know what I'm saying? You know it's a story. I don't think they ever present them like they're real stories. Maybe it's just because we're so far removed from it. Maybe they thought they were real back then. I don't know, but I know that when you read Hercules, you don't think he really existed. But when you read Jesus, they make too many claims that he existed. So, but the question was, where does Jesus, the question was, is there any proof of Jesus outside of biblical text? Isn't it amazing, though, that there's more testimony about Jesus through the Bible, but we have to throw all that out, okay? So we throw all that out, and so there's actually 14 references in history close by that to basically Jesus. There's more evidence that, now realize Jesus was things that were written down on scrolls and papyrus that basically deteriorated. When we look back on time during that thing, Pontius Pilate crucified Jesus, okay? That's his greatest claim to fame. How much proof do you think we have that Pontius Pilate was actually someone who lived? Actually, less than that. We have someone where people will say, reference Pontius Pilate as the man who crucified Christ, okay? And that's mostly, we found the ark when they dug up a stone that was called the Pilate stone that actually mentions his name as he was a governor of Jerusalem at some point in time. Basically it's a decree he made that was written on a stone. So that's the only thing they have that's proof of him. We have, like Mark said, we probably have more proof of Jesus than we do of Caesar, but we definitely have more proof of Jesus than we do of Plato. Does anybody believe that Plato was not a real human being? The only reason people don't believe Jesus was a real human being is because he was Jesus. So, all right, so let's go through the list of people that talk about Jesus. Josephus, do we know who Josephus was?
Jewish historian.
Jewish historian. He was a Jew that was a general, and he was in a town, and they were supposed to defend the town, and the Romans came over and had them locked in, and there was 10 of them left, and so they couldn't be taken captive by the Romans. So the last 10 men basically drew lots, and 2 men, Josephus was one and another man, basically were going to kill the 10 guys, the ones, so they wouldn't be taken alive. And then after they did that, they decided that maybe it'd be better just to, instead of fighting to the death between the 2 of them, they would be better just to turn themselves over. So they did, and that's how they were captured by the Romans, and he became a slave to Tiberius. And he basically, Tiberius liked him, and he gave him his freedom, and he later wrote a book about the best way to describe it, he helped the Romans understand the Jewish minds during the wars. He would go in, he was there with them with the Romans when they destroyed Jerusalem. So, yeah. But he wrote the book of the Jewish Wars, and so he mentions Jesus in 2 places. One of those mentions is has probably been doctored up by a scribe somewhere along the way, because he basically speaks too highly of Jesus. Okay, he basically calls him the Christ and everything. So we don't doubt that he actually wrote about Jesus there. We just doubt that he said he was not a believer, so we doubt that he said the things that were said. He later speaks another place about him. He talks about Jesus' brother James, okay? He talks about James, and James was, we talked about the high priest, and a month ago, and I was telling you how Annas had 5 sons, and he had a 6th son that was a son-in-law, but the last son, his last son, that all of them became priests, and the last one that became priest was ironically named Jesus, okay? Jesus Ananias, that was his father's last name, so he became the high priest, and he was so agitated by James, the brother of of Jesus, the brother of Jesus, that when the governor was out of town, he had that's when he killed James, had James put to death. And the governor came back and put him he was no longer the high priest after that. And he talks about that. But so if Jesus is not a real person, he wouldn't have a brother, And he when he talks about James, he says James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, so we know that. Okay, so Tactius, he was a Roman senator, and he was in charge of keeping tabs on all the religions in the Roman Empire. So he got all the information on it. He wrote some, and he wrote about Jesus and the rebellion that came out of that. And he wrote about the fact that Jesus, the followers of Jesus, raised so much Cain, or according to them, that that they put them out of Rome. We know that happened. That's where I wish my mind would remember.
Prisca and Aquila.
Right. They were no longer living in Rome because the emperor had put all the Jews out of Rome. Okay. And so that history, when he talks about it, agrees with the Bible. He also talks about the fact, now this was in 116 AD, so it was after. He talks about the fact that Nero was accusing the Christians of things they didn't do, that he was burning them in the gardens for fire, for light. He talks about how terrible they were being treated, and we know all that's true too. There's a guy named Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor like Pontius Pilate was, and he wrote a report that went back to the emperor, talking about the followers of Christ, okay? He was talking about the followers of Christ. He was saying, so this is 112 AD, so it's not 100 years after it, and the followers of Christ are singing words. He talks about how they tried to keep the laws, and they made bonds between themselves to not. He was basically saying they were good citizens, but he did say they sang songs to Jesus as if he was a god, as he was God. Okay, so all right. Yeah, Suetonius talks about Jesus, and he talked about the expelling of Jews out of Rome. Okay.
Right before I came tonight, I was listening about Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
So he also became a Christian during that time.
Okay.
And he was an emperor.
Right. Right, and Mara bar Cyprian in 70 AD, he was a Stoic philosopher, and he talked about the fact that the Jews talked about who was the Greek philosopher they put to, it wasn't Plato, it was Socrates they put to death. He talked about how the town, how they suffered from putting him to death, and then he talked about how the Jews had killed their king, and this was right at this destruction of Jerusalem, and he basically blamed it on them killing Jesus. Okay, that's why this had come to pass on them. And then the Babylonian Talmud, that's the rabbinical writings, okay, mentioned, and it was written around 100 AD, and they mentioned that Jesus was got hung on a cross, and they mentioned that he was doing sorcery. So, this is the Jews, so his work was, just like the Bible said, they were accusing him of all the works being sorcery. Okay? So, but you have all those things. There's, like I said, there's 14 references. I didn't write them all down. Okay, so but what do most historians think? I'm talking about historians that don't believe in Jesus. Without the little tiny bit of people that believe he was a myth or legend, all historians believe, most historians will at least admit that Jesus was a historical figure. They don't admit he's God, but they admit he was a real human being. Yeah. And so, I mean, even Bart Ehrman wrote a book, basically, I guess because he was tired of his people who come to listen to him talking about Jesus never existing. He wrote a book that he didn't believe in Jesus as in God, but he wrote a book basically stating that
Does Islam say he was a rabbi and a prophet?
Yeah, 600-700 years after he was.
Yeah.
They think he was a prophet. They believe he was born of a virgin. They believe he never sinned.
They don't believe he was resurrected after this.
They don't believe he was crucified. They believe, well, they just said that they crucified him not. There's some things that say that maybe Judas took his place. But we know that's not how Judas died, so, But, so in the end, in the Muslim faith, Judas is the hero because he takes the place, the fall for Jesus. But they've also, so when you're talking about the record about whether Jesus was, is he historical, okay? Well, these are the people that don't believe in Jesus, but they believe they don't believe he was God, but they believe he was a man that actually lived, because and there's two reasons they believe, and that is because of the story of the baptism of John the Baptist baptized him, and his death on the cross. Does anybody know why that would be confirming evidence that this is a true story? At least that part of it's true. Because John baptizing Jesus is an embarrassing story. It makes John the Baptist greater than Jesus at that, So why would they talk about that? I mean, we know what Christians know that what took place there was they did it for all righteousness' sake. So basically, Jesus is baptized into our sins because that's what they were washing off of that river, and he's also anointed as a priest by another priest. And at the age of 30, I'm just saying that's what it was originally, when the book of Numbers puts out, says that when they counted the priests, they counted all the men at the age of 20. Okay? But when they got to the priest, they didn't count them until they were 30. Because that's when you could become a priest. Now, by the time Jesus was around, they were anointing priests at the age of 20, but not when the law was set out originally. So that's kind of why, I've always thought that was why Jesus' ministry started when he was 30, because he was now old enough to be our priest, okay? So, but that's why they say that they wouldn't have, if that story, you don't tell embarrassing stories, and you do not tell stories where your hero dies on a cross, and that's why. Another proof that Jesus was existed is that there's a drawing where it's a little drawing that I guess one Roman soldier made up about another one, and it basically shows a stick figure on a cross with the head of a donkey, and a man kneeling down to worship him, and it said, whatever the name is, Brutus worships his God, as a making fun of him. So basically, there's quite a bit of evidence that Jesus was. But we don't look at any of the scriptures. So the scriptures, we have how do I say this? If you look at what the writings, if you look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, the things that give testimony of Christ, they claim they were written later. That's not what, it seems like they were written very early. When they dug up the bone boxes, the ossuaries, they dug all those up, and we have just like you can get the top 100 names of people who were born this year. What are the number one baby names? You can find that out. I can go look on what the top 100 list of baby names were in 2025. And from the birth certificates that they will be able to tell you. But from the bone ossuaries, they've dug up so many of them that we know that what the top 100 names in Jerusalem were for men. We don't know what the top 100 names were for women were, because there wasn't that many names for women. Okay, there was 3 or 4 names. But if you were writing a story outside the land and you weren't an eyewitness of it, and you're telling the story, you're not going to get the names right. You know what I'm saying? You're making it up. We have gospels that we know aren't real, and they tell stories, and they don't get the names right. They call, we have the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of so many other Gospels that basically are made up stories. They don't have the geography, they don't have the cities because they didn't live there and they couldn't look it up on Google, okay? And they didn't have they just didn't have it. So when they tell the stories, they don't get it right. But when the gospel tells the stories, when it talks about going up to a town, if you go there, it's actually uphill to that town. If they're going down to something, it's actually downhill to that town, okay? And when they talk about how long something takes, they're right. So when they talk about feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, they talk about the bread they fed them and how much grass is around, and talk about the type of bread it was, and it was barley bread. And it was the time of year that it wouldn't have been wheat bread. It would have been barley, okay? They get that right. They get the fact that when they said there was much green grass around because that's the time of year they get all their rainfall, okay? So they get that right, but then that's one thing. But if I tell you a story about people you don't know, you may get the story right if you repeat it. But you will not get the names right. If I tell you of my friend Joe, okay? By the time you tell, if it was a good enough story for you to repeat, it's not, Joe's name won't be there anymore. It'll be John's friend, okay? Or this guy John knows, it won't be. But when the Bible tells the stories, this is according to the auxiliaries, when it mentions a name that's in the top 10, top 15, and it gives somebody's name, they give them identifiers, because if you're talking today, and the name Michael is very common, so if you're talking about a Michael, you better put his last name on it, and that's what an identifier was. So they talk all about that, and when they mention somebody's name like Barnabas, who's number 68 on the list, it's no identifier, because there weren't any Barnabases around except for him, so everybody knew who you were talking about, And these are all the things that make, Peter Williams wrote this book on Are the Gospels Trustworthy, and all this is in that book, and it's very scholarly, but the scholars don't read those books, okay? So the fact is that, it's like when they talk about architectural features that we don't know, as they've dug things up, the architecture's been right. When Luke talks in Acts about areas they were in and who the governor is or whatever, they've come to realize that they've thought, well, obviously he didn't know what he's talking about because that's not who would have been the governor, but they realized that the course of the river changed, and basically Luke was right. It's just every time it lines up, you cannot find something. Actually, if you find something you think's wrong with the New Testament, just wait. It'll be right before you know it, okay? When we get enough evidence. But that's never considered, but there's lots of, the Lord has, how do I say this? When it comes to your faith, all those things don't make you believe. But you have a reasonable hope and faith because of all those things. You know what I'm saying? You don't have faith because like people talk about having faith in your faith. No, you can actually read something that is reliable and true. And, doesn't mean that you have to believe he was Christ, but that's up to the Lord. So, any questions? Us, Brian.
Did the Dead Sea Scrolls help the case any, or not really?
The Dead Sea Scrolls were written around the time. They don't talk about. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written around the time of Jesus and before Jesus. They actually predate Jesus. Like, one of the wonderful things the Dead Sea Scrolls did is that people will talk about. The liberals will talk about there were, the two Isaiahs, and basically one was written first and one was written later. If you read the book of Daniel, okay, what do the liberals say about Daniel? It wasn't actually written until about 170 BC. It wasn't written by Daniel. Okay, I've listened to that this week. Okay, I have listened to some terrible stuff this week. And ask me what basis do they believe that? Why do they believe that Daniel wasn't written until after 170? Because his prophecy came true, so it couldn't have been written beforehand. So the wonderful thing about Isaiah is, and it being discovered, is Isaiah has in the in Isaiah, we have Isaiah 53. Starts in 52, but we have the suffering servant. Like Psalm 22, there's not a better description of what's going on. I mean, the gospel of, that's why they call it the gospel of Isaiah, because it pretty much is. It's like a fifth gospel. But, so when they dug up the Dead Sea Scrolls, before that they talked about, where it says his hands and feet where he's been pierced, okay, in the things. If you read the Jewish their version of Isaiah, they had that his hands and feet had been clawed at, not pierced, okay? There was adjustment, and they basically made the claim that Christians had authored the scriptures because we wanted it to be about Christ when it wasn't about Christ. And that was the proof, because the Jews had a much better scribe system than we did, but theirs was from 800 AD. That's the oldest one they had. So when we dug up the scroll, we had Isaiah. We had many copies of Isaiah, and guess what they say? They said his hands were pierced, and it says exactly the stuff in there. And we know that it predates Jesus. So the truth is, the Dead Sea Scrolls are incredible evidence that that Christ is who he says he was. But the Dead Sea Scrolls had lots of there was lots of mystical stuff going on around then, and so they have. It'd be like if you walked into a library, the church library. Well, I know that when I walked into the church library, and we built some shelves, and they were clearing out the stuff, and there was some theological books in there that you would not want to say, here, go read this, okay? It was like I would see some of them, and I thought, how did that get in a Presbyterian church, okay? But I didn't get in the church at all, but there were lots of romance novels too, so, but I'm sure they were Christian romance novels. So, but I'm just saying so the Dead Sea Scrolls got stuff that, but it's got all the books of the Old Testament. It predates the New Testament, so, but it has some of the writings, like the Book of Enoch and that. So, any other questions? And hopefully y'all will never have to listen to me talk for a long time. Okay? All right.
Thank you. Well, y'all don't have to go home, we can stay here. That's my system. So I'm closing the door. Okay.